in the forgotten hollow of Harrow's End, a town cradled by steep, pine-choked hills where the sun seemed reluctant to linger. A strange tale had woven itself into the fabric of the community a story they called the Lantern Man. This wasn't your typical ghost yarn spun by grandmothers to keep children from wandering too far, nor was it the kind of tall tale swapped over pints at the local tavern. No, the Lantern Man was something murkier, something that didn't fit neatly into the boxes of the living or the dead. Here, it existed in the liminal spaces, where the edges of reality blurred, where the faint glow of a flame could twist the shadows into shapes no one dared name. The townsfolk whispered about him in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the woods as if the mere mention might summon that eerie light through the mist. Harrow's End itself was a place that seemed to invite such legends. Tucked deep in a valley carved by a river long since dwindled to a trickle, it was a town perpetually shrouded in fog-thick. Clinging haze that rolled down from the peaks and settled like a second skin over the clapboard houses and sagging barns. The air always carried a damp chill, even in summer, and the forest that ringed the town loomed tall and silent, its gnarled pines standing like sentinels guarding secrets older than the settlement itself. The people here were hardy, weathered by isolation and the harshness of the land, but they weren't prone to flights of fancy. That's what made the story of the Lantern Man so unsettling. It wasn't born of idle imagination, but of something real, something they'd seen with their own eyes. It all began decades ago, back when the town still had a handful of souls who remembered a time before the railroad bypassed them, leaving Harrow's End to fade into obscurity. Among them was Old Man Carver, a grizzled trapper whose leathery face and calloused hands told a story of a life spent wresting a living from the wilderness. Carver wasn't the friendly sort, kept to himself. His cabin, a ramshackle outpost on the edge of the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. But he was a fixture in the town nonetheless. A man who knew every deer trail, every hidden spring, every twist of the woods better than anyone alive. Folks relied on him in a quiet way, trading for the pelts he brought in, nodding respectfully when he passed through with his burlap sack slung over one shoulder and his lantern swinging from his belt. That lantern was a peculiar thing hand forged, its iron frame rusted but sturdy, its glass panes smudged with years of soot. It wasn't bright or fancy, just a practical tool for a man who worked in the dark hours. But it was as much a part of Carver as his weathered boots or the knife he kept strapped to his thigh. So when he didn't return one crisp October night, when the wind carried a bite and the leaves glowed red under a harvest moon, the townsfolk took notice. At first, they figured he'd holed up somewhere, waiting out a storm or tending a trapline. But days turned to a week, and a week stretched into 2, and still no sign of him came. A search party formed, gruff men with rifles and lanterns of their own, women with shawls pulled tight against the cold, even a few wide-eyed kids tagging along despite their mothers' protests. They combed the woods for 3 days, shouting Carver's name until their voices grew hoarse, the echoes swallowed by the dense trees. They found nothing, no tracks, no scraps of clothing, no sign of a struggle. Just silence, heavy and unbroken, until the 4th day, when young Ellie Pruitt, barely 12 and sharp-eyed, spotted something glinting in the gloom. There, Deep in the pines where the undergrowth thickened and the light barely pierced, hung Carver's lantern. It dangled from a crooked branch, its flame still burning a steady, impossible glow that hadn't dimmed, despite the days it must have hung there, untended. The searchers stared, their breath fogging in the chill as the lantern swayed gently, as if placed there moments before. No one wanted to touch it at first. Something about that light felt wrong, like it wasn't meant for their hands. But practicality won out. Jeb Tanner, a burly farmer with a no-nonsense streak, stepped forward, snuffed the flame with a quick puff, and unhooked it from the branch. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he did, the air growing colder, sharper, though no one spoke of it then. They carried it back to town, a grim trophy of their failure to find Carver, and set it on the mantle in the meeting hall, figuring someone might claim it one day. They told themselves that was the end of it, that Carver had met some mundane fatigue fall, a bear, a sudden sickness, and that the lantern was just a lantern, nothing more. But Harrow's End wasn't done with the Lantern Man, not by a long shot. The days after Old Man Carver's lantern was brought back to Harrow's End were quiet ones, at least on the surface. The townsfolk went about their cars mending fences, splitting firewood, boiling vats of apple butter as the autumn deepened, but there was a tension in the air, a weight that hadn't been there before. The meeting hall, where the lantern sat on its mantle like an uninvited guest, became a place people avoided, unless they had to. Kids dared each other to peek through the windows at it, but even the boldest ones didn't linger long. The adults didn't talk about it much, not directly. They'd nod toward the woods or mutter about the weather turning sour. But Carver's name stayed unspoken, as if saying it might stir something they'd rather leave sleeping. It didn't take long for the whispers to start, though. At first, it was just odd-a-tizzle little things that could have been chalked up to imagination or the tricks of a tired mind. Millie Granger, who ran the general store, swore she saw a faint glow bobbing along the tree line one evening as she locked up, too steady to be a firefly and too dim for a hunter's torch. She rubbed her eyes, blamed it on the fog playing with her head, and kept it to herself. Then, Tom Wickham, a logger who worked the northern slopes, came into town with a story about hearing a hum out in the woods. Not a tune, not a voice, just a low, steady drone that made his dogs whimper and refuse to follow him past the first ridge. He laughed it off over a beer at the Rusty Nail, but his hands shook when he lifted the glass. The sightings grew from there, creeping into the edges of daily life like the mist that never quite burned off. Farmers checking their livestock at dusk began to notice it, a soft amber flicker weaving through the pines, always at a distance, never close enough to chase. It didn't blaze like a bonfire or dart like an animal's eyes. Catching the light, it moved with purpose, swaying as if carried by an unseen hand. Some said it was Carver, still out there, lost in the forest depths, searching for a path home with that damned lantern of his. Others weren't so sure. "That ain't no man," Widow Hargrove muttered one Sunday after church, her voice sharp as she clutched her Bible. Carver knew those woods. He'd have found his way back if he could. That's something else wearing his light. Theories sprouted like weeds. Maybe it was a will-o'-the-wisp, the old swamp gas-tail parents told to explain away strange glows. But the woods around Harrow's End weren't marshy, and the light didn't dance or flicker like Gasset held steady, deliberate. A few of the older folks, the ones who remembered tales from their own grandparents, spoke of older things, spirits or entities that lingered where men met bad ends, drawn to the relics they left behind. Carver's lantern, they said, might have caught something's eye, something that liked the glow too much to let it fade. The idea stuck, even if no one could prove it, and soon enough, folks stopped calling it Carver's lantern altogether. It was the Lantern Man now, a name that carried a shiver all its own. The town tried to move on. Jeb Tanner, who'd taken the lantern down from that branch, suggested they bury it or toss it into the river, but no one volunteered to touch it again. It stayed in the meeting hall, gathering dust, its glass panes dark but somehow watchful. Life crept back to as normal as it could be, with the forest pressing in and the fog thickening each night. But the Lantern Man didn't fade into a fireside story. If anything, he grew bolder. Hunters started avoiding the deeper trails, claiming they'd feel a cold snap in the air and catch that hum. Faint but unmistakable, trailing just behind them. Kids stopped playing near the woods after dusk, and even the crows seemed quieter, their caws swallowed by the haze. By the time I arrived in Harrow's End years later, the legend had settled into the town's bones, a quiet haunt that didn't need to shout to be felt. I'd heard the whispers every newcomer did, but I didn't put much stock in them. I was a photographer, drawn to the valley's stark beauty, its endless gray skies and skeletal trees. The Lantern Man was just local color to me, a spooky footnote for a place that already looked like it belonged in a ghost story. I figured it was all fog and shadows, maybe a fox with a glowing bug in its jaws, or some hermit playing tricks. I was wrong, of course, but I wouldn't know that until the night I went looking for a perfect shot and found something else instead. I rolled into Harrow's End on a late September afternoon, my beat-up hatchback rattling over the pitted road that wound down into the valley. The fog was already thick, curling around the tires like it was trying to pull me in, and the town emerged from it piece by piece. First, the faded sign reading, "Welcome to Harrow's End Est, 1872. Then the cluster of weathered houses hunched against the hills. I'd found the place by accident, flipping through a photography forum online where someone had posted a grainy shot of the valley at dawn. Mist spilling over the pines, the sky a bruised purple, everything silent and still. It was the kind of scene that begged to be captured, and I'd been chasing scenes like that for years ever since I'd picked up a camera to escape the noise of city life. The town wasn't much to look at up close. A single street ran through it, lined with a general store, a tavern called the Rusty Nail, and a handful of shops that looked like they hadn't seen new paint since the Nixon era. The meeting hall sat at the far end, its steeple poking through the haze like a finger pointing to nowhere. People moved slow here, their faces etched with the kind of weariness that comes from living too long in a place the world forgot. They eyed me as I unloaded my gear camera bag, tripod, a duffel stuffed with clothes, but they didn't say much beyond a nod or a grunted afternoon. I didn't mind. I wasn't here for conversation. I was here for the light, the shadows, the way the fog turned everything into a dream you couldn't quite wake from. I rented a room above the general store from Millie Granger, a wiry woman with gray streaks in her hair and a habit of chewing on the end of her pencil while she rang up sales. She didn't ask many questions, just handed me a key and warned me to keep the windows shut at night. "Fog gets in," she said, her tone flat but her eyes lingering on me a beat too long. I nodded, figuring she meant the damp, and hauled my stuff upstairs. The room was small, with a creaky bed, a dresser missing a knob, and a view of the woods that pressed right up to the town's edge. I could see why people stayed away from those trees. They loomed dark and heavy, their branches tangled like they were holding something in. It didn't take long to hear about the Lantern Man. Millie mentioned it offhand the next day while I was buying coffee, her voice low as she leaned over the counter. "You planning to shoot out in the woods?" she asked, and when I said yeah, she pursed her lips. "Just watch yourself after dark. Folks see things out there. The Lantern Man, they call it." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Small towns always had their ghost stories, and I'd heard plenty before. Later, at the Rusty Nail, a logger named Tom Wickham filled in some gaps over a beer I bought him. He was a big guy, hands scarred from years of swinging an axe, but his voice dropped when he talked about it. "Ain't no joke," he said, staring into his glass. "Glows out there, moves like it's looking for something. Been that way since Carver went missing." He told me about the trapper, the lantern, the search party bits, and pieces of the tale I'd already caught in passing. I listened, nodded, filed it away as local flavor. A good shot of that glow, if it was real, might even make a nice addition to my portfolio. I spent my first week scouting the valley, hiking the trails by day, snapping photos of the riverbed's cracked mud, the twisted roots clawing out of the earth. The way the mist softened every edge until it felt like the world was dissolving. The woods were quiet, too quiet maybe, with no birdsong or rustling critters to break the stillness, but I chalked it up to the season. The Lantern Man stayed a rumor, something I'd smirk about when I overheard it at the store or the tavern. I'd seen nothing but fog and shadows, and I wasn't the type to jump at every creek in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me back, its silence less empty than it should have been. That changed on my 8th night in Harrow's End. I'd been restless, itching for a shot I hadn't found yet, something raw, something that'd make people stop scrolling and stare. The moon was due to rise full over the valley, and I figured the light cutting through the fog could be it. I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and a jacket, and headed out after supper, ignoring Millie's raised eyebrow as I passed her on the stairs. The trailhead was a mile out, and by the time I reached it, the sun was gone, the sky a deep indigo bleeding into black. The fog was thicker than ever, swallowing the beam of my flashlight after a few feet. I didn't care I'd shot in worse conditions. I set off into the woods, chasing the perfect frame, oblivious to the hum that started faint and far behind me, growing closer with every step. The forest swallowed me whole that night, the fog wrapping around me like a damp shroud as I picked my way along the trail. My flashlight cut a weak path through the murk, its beam bouncing off gnarled trunks and slick moss, but it didn't reach far, just enough to keep me from tripping over roots or stumbling into the underbrush. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, and the cold seeped through my jacket, prickling my skin. I'd planned to hike a mile in, find a clearing I'd scouted earlier that week, and set up for the moonrise shot. It was a simple enough goal, but the woods felt different after dark bigger. Somehow, like they stretched beyond what I'd been daylight. I'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when my camera battery died. I cursed under my breath, fumbling with the spares in my bag. But the spares were dead too brand new, fully charged that morning, now useless. That should have been my first warning, but I shrugged it off as bad luck, some glitch in the cold. I switched to my phone, figuring its camera would do in a pinch, only to find the screen flickering, the signal bars flat. No service, no GPS, just a dim glow that barely lit my hands. I stopped, squinting into the fog, trying to get my bearings. The trail marker-soled wooden posts I'd relied on were nowhere in sight. The silence pressed in, unbroken by wind or wildlife. And for the first time, I felt a twinge of unease. That's when I heard it, a low hum, faint at first, like the buzz of a distant power line. I turned, scanning the trees, but the fog was too thick to see much. The sound grew, not louder so much as clearer, a steady drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't natural, not wind, not an animal, not anything I could place. I told myself it was a trick of the valley, an echo bouncing off the hills, but my pulse quickened anyway. I hefted my bag higher on my shoulder and kept moving, faster now, the clearing still my goal. The hum followed, threading through the stillness, patient and unhurried. I don't know how long I walked before I saw the light. It flickered into view ahead, a soft amber glow swaying between the pines, maybe 50 yards off. My breath caught, and I froze, watching it bob gently, like a lantern carried by someone strolling through the dark. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking the silence. No answer. The light paused, just for a second, then drifted closer, slow and deliberate. I squinted, trying to make out a figure behind a hunter, a hiker, but there was nothing, just the glow hanging in the air, untethered. My mind raced. A flashlight? No. Too warm, too steady. A fire? Too small, too mobile. The lantern man flickered through my thoughts, but I shoved it down. I'd come here for a photo, not a ghost story. I stepped back, my boot crunching on a twig, and the light tilted, as if it noticed. The hum sharpened, rising into something almost alive, a sound that wasn't just noise but intent, hungry and searching. The air turned frigid, a sudden drop that made my teeth ache, and the glow spilled toward me, stretching my shadow long and thin across the ground. I couldn't move at first, pinned by that light, my heart slamming against my ribs. Then instinct kicked in. I turned and ran. My boots pounded the forest floor as I ran, the fog swirling around me like a living thing, clawing at my legs and face. Branches snapped underfoot, and twigs raked my arms, snagging my jacket as I tore through the undergrowth. I didn't know where I was going away from that light, that hum. That was all that mattered. My flashlight bounced uselessly in my hand, its beam jerking wildly, catching flashes of pine trunks and twisted roots before the fog swallowed them again. My breath came in sharp gasps, fogging in the icy air, and my lungs burned with every inhale. The cold wasn't natural. It bit deeper than any October night should, sinking into my bones like I'd plunged into a frozen lake. Behind me, the hum never faltered. It didn't grow louder or fat, it stayed steady, a relentless thread weaving through the trees, tracking me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and there it was. That amber glow, swaying gently, closer now than it should have been. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the light cutting through the mist, effortless and inevitable. My stomach lurched. Whatever held that lantern, if anything, it wasn't running, wasn't scrambling through the brush like I was. It glided, smooth and unhurried, like it knew I couldn't outpace it forever. I tripped, my foot catching a root I hadn't seen, and went down hard. My flashlight skittered away, its beam spinning into the fog before winking out. I hit the ground with a grunt, pain shooting through my knee, and scrambled to my feet, hands slick with mud and pine needles. The hum was closer now, wrapping around me, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I spun around, searching for the light, and saw it 20 yards off, maybe less, hovering just above the earth. The lantern's glow spilled out, its glass panes casting a dull, sooty sheen, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the light, a shape, tall and thin, its edges smudged like ink bleeding into water. Then the fog shifted, and it was gone if it had ever been there at all. Panic clawed at my throat. I bolted again, no plan, no direction, just the primal need to move. The forest blurred pastries, shadows, the endless gray of the mist. My camera bag slammed against my hip with every step, a useless weight now, but I couldn't stop to ditch it. The hum pressed in, threading through my skull, and the cold tightened its grip, numbing my fingers, slowing my legs. I didn't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. It all smeared together, but the glow never left me. It flickered at the edge of my vision, sometimes ahead, sometimes beside me, like it was herding me deeper into the woods. Then, through the haze, I saw it. The faint outline of a roof, a chimney jutting into the sky, a cabin carver's cabin maybe, or some hunter's shack. Salvation. I veered toward it, hope flaring despite the dread gnawing at my gut. The hum spiked, sharp and insistent, and the light swung into my path, cutting me off. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving, as the lantern hung there, blocking the way. Its glow pulsed once, slow and deliberate, and the air grew so cold I could feel my eyelashes frost. I backed up, heart hammering, and it drifted closer, unyielding. The cabin faded into the fog behind it, unreachable. I turned and ran again, blind now, every step a gamble. The hum followed, patient as ever, and the light stayed with me, a predator toying with its prey. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. My legs were lead, my breath ragged, but I knew one thing. Whatever the lantern man was, it wasn't done with me yet. The forest seemed to twist around me as I stumbled through the dark, my strength draining with every step. The fog pressed in tighter, a suffocating wall that blurred the trees into smears of shadow, and my legs trembled, threatening to give out. The hum was a constant now, a low thrumming in my ears that drowned out my own ragged breathing, and the amber glow of the lantern flickered just behind me, ways behind me, no matter which way I turned. I'd stopped looking back, seeing it only made the fear sharper, and I couldn't afford to freeze again. My hands were numb, my jacket soaked with sweat and mist, and the cold had settled so deep I could barely feel my feet hitting the ground. I don't know how I found the trail again. Maybe dumb luck. Maybe some shred of instinct kicking in through the panic. One minute I was crashing through brambles. The next my boots hit packed dirt, and I recognized the curve of the path, the same one I'd taken from town. Relief surged, brittle and fleeting, but it was enough to push me forward. The hum didn't waver, and the light stayed close, but the thought of Harrow's end lights, people, a locked door kept me moving. I ran until my lungs screamed, until the fog thinned just enough to show the faint glow of the town's street lamps ahead. I burst out of the woods, nearly collapsing as I hit the open ground. The general store loomed ahead, its windows dark, and I staggered toward it, fumbling for the key Millie had given me. My hands shook so badly, I dropped it twice before jamming it into the lock. The door creaked open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut and twisting the bolt. I sank to the floor, back against the wood, gasping for air. The hum was gone or so faint I couldn't hear it over my own pulse, and the light didn't follow me in. I sat there, shivering, waiting for my heart to slow, half expecting to see that glow seep under the door. Sleep didn't come that night. I stayed awake, curled on the bed with the lights on, replaying every second of the chase. Morning crept in gray and slow, the fog still thick outside, and I dragged myself downstairs. Millie was behind the counter, eyeing me as I shuffled in. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone too knowing. I nodded, too drained to lie, and she didn't push. But when I stepped onto the porch for air, I froze. There, on the steps, sat my camera, the one I'd lost in the woods when I fell. Its strap was coiled neatly, the lens cap on, and the battery, dead last night, was full when I checked it. I flipped through the memory card, hands trembling, and found one new photo. It was me standing in the forest, my face pale and wide-eyed, staring straight at the lens like I'd posed for it. Behind me, the lantern glowed, its light casting a sickly hue over the trees. And in that light, something stood, thin, its form blurred like smoke curling in the wind. No face, no eyes, just a presence that made my skin crawl. I hadn't taken that shot. I couldn't have. I don't go into the woods anymore. I've packed my gear, booked a bus out of Harrow's End, but I can't shake the feeling that leaving won't be enough. The fog still creeps up to my windows some nights, heavier than it should be, and I catch that amber flicker in the distance out there, waiting. The hum follows me in my dreams, soft and patient, like it knows I'll step outside again someday. And that photo? I deleted it, smashed the memory card, but I swear I still see it when I close my eyes. Me, the lantern, and whatever's holding it, watching from the dark.